What would you do if you found 3 children abandoned in the rain with no one to protect them? In this gripping story, Ben and Rachel, grieving the loss of their own child, open their home to 2 infants and a young boy named Tyler. But as they grow closer to the children, they uncover disturbing secrets about the orphanage they came from. Secrets that could change everything. As Ben, a determined police officer, investigates the orphanage, he discovers that Miss Harper, its director, is hiding something far darker than they imagined. With time running out, Ben and Rachel must fight to keep the children safe while facing dangerous truths about their past. Will they save the children and build a new family, or will the shadows of the orphanage tear them apart? Hit subscribe and comment below to join us on this emotional journey. The rain fell in relentless sheets, pounding the windshield of Officer Ben Williams' patrol car. The wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, their mechanical swipes barely clearing the water before it returned in full force. Ben drove slowly through the small, deserted town, his headlights casting weak beams onto the slick pavement ahead. The streets were empty, not a soul in sight, save for the occasional flicker of lightning that illuminated the darkened buildings. It was nearing midnight, and the storm had brought with it an eerie stillness, a silence that matched the emptiness inside Ben. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the empty sidewalks, though his mind was far from the task at hand. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the place he tried so hard to avoid, memories of his son, Noah. The weight of loss hung over him like the storm clouds above, and no matter how hard he tried to bury it, grief always found a way to seep through. It had been nearly a year since the accident, a year since Ben and Rachel's world had been shattered, their lives upended by a tragedy that neither of them had seen coming. Noah had been their everything, their light, their joy. And in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Ben had replayed the events of that day 1,000 times in his mind, wondering if there was something he could have done differently. But the truth was, it didn't matter. Noah was gone, and no amount of regret or guilt would change that. Ben sighed, his breath fogging up the window slightly. He wiped at the condensation with the back of his hand, the simple action reminding him of the countless times he had wiped the fog from the bathroom mirror after Noah's baths. Noah had loved baths, splashing around like he was in his own little ocean, his laughter filling the house in a way that seemed impossible now. Home. Ben hadn't thought of it as that for a long time. After Noah's death, it had become just a house, a place where memories hung in the air like ghosts, haunting every room. Rachel had retreated into herself, shutting out the world, and Ben along with it. She spent most of her days in their bedroom, sitting by the window, staring out at the garden that Noah used to play in. Ben had tried, at first, to reach her, to pull her out of the darkness that had consumed her, but every attempt felt like a failure, and eventually he had given up. Now his patrol car was the closest thing to home. Out here, in the quiet of the night, he could avoid the painful reminders that waited for him back at the house. He could pretend, if only for a few hours, that the world hadn't fallen apart. The crackle of the police radio broke through the silence, a garbled voice coming through the static. Ben barely registered the call. It was routine stuff, nothing urgent. He let the radio chatter fade into the background, his mind once again drifting. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with a message. It was from his partner, Dave Reynolds, checking in on him. Dave had been trying to be there for Ben since the accident, but Ben had kept him at arm's length. He appreciated the concern, but the truth was he didn't want anyone to get too close. It was easier that way, easier to keep the pain contained, to keep the walls up. Ben ignored the message, his gaze returning to the rain-soaked streets. The storm had worsened, the wind howling through the empty alleys and rattling the street signs. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, nearly midnight. He should head back to the station soon, finish out the rest of his shift. As he turned down a side street, something caught his eye. A figure, small and hunched, standing on the sidewalk. Ben blinked, unsure if the rain was playing tricks on him. But no. There it was again, illuminated by a flash of lightning. A child, standing alone in the storm. Ben's heart lurched. He slowed the car and pulled over to the curb, his pulse quickening as he grabbed his flashlight from the seat beside him. He stepped out into the rain, the cold water immediately soaking through his uniform, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the small figure ahead, standing so still in the downpour. "Hey!" Ben called out, his voice barely carried over the roar of the storm. "Are you okay?" The child didn't respond, didn't move. Ben quickened his pace, his boots splashing through puddles as he approached. It wasn't until he was just a few feet away that he could make out the details. The child, a boy no older than 8 or 9, was drenched from head to toe. His hair clung to his forehead and his clothes were soaked through, plastered to his small frame. But what stopped Ben in his tracks were the 2 tiny bundles the boy was holding. 2 infants, wrapped in drenched blankets, their faces pale and cold. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He crouched down, trying to make himself appear less threatening, though his heart was racing. "Hey, buddy," Ben said softly, his voice trembling with concern. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer right away. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Ben could see it, the same hollow look he saw in the mirror every day. The look of someone who had lost too much, who had seen things no child should ever have to see. "I don't have parents," the boy finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "They're gone." Ben's chest tightened. He looked down at the babies in the boy's arms, their small faces shivering from the cold. Without thinking, Ben shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around them, trying to give them some warmth. "You're safe now," Ben said gently. "I'm Officer Williams. I'm going to help you, okay?" The boy didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Ben took that as a sign of trust, however small it was. He carefully took the infants from the boy's arms, cradling them against his chest. They were so light, so fragile, and the coldness of their skin sent a jolt of urgency through Ben. "Come with me," Ben said, motioning toward the patrol car. "We'll get you out of this rain." The boy hesitated for a moment, but then, as if too tired to resist, he nodded and followed Ben to the car. Ben opened the back door, placing the babies inside as gently as he could. The boy climbed in after them, curling up in the seat, his small body trembling. Ben shut the door and rushed to the driver's side, his mind racing. Who would leave children out here in the middle of a storm? And why? The boy hadn't said much, but Ben could sense the weight of whatever he was carrying. There was a story here, one that was too familiar, too close to the pain Ben himself was living with. As he pulled away from the curb, Ben glanced in the rearview mirror. The boy was staring out the window, silent, while the babies lay bundled in the blankets. Ben's heart ached for them. They were so vulnerable, so helpless, just like Noah had been in those final moments. Ben's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't know where this night would lead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let these children slip through the cracks, not like he had with his own son. The rain hadn't let up by the time Ben arrived at the police station. He pulled into the lot, parked, and took a moment to steady his breath before getting out. The infants were quiet now, wrapped snugly in his jacket, their tiny chests rising and falling with each shallow breath. Tyler, Ben had learned the boy's name during the drive, sat beside them, his small face blank, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion that came from more than just physical fatigue. Ben opened the back door and gently lifted the babies out, cradling them against his chest. They were so cold, too cold. He needed to get them inside, warm them up. He motioned for Tyler to follow, and the boy did so without a word, trailing after him like a shadow. The station was quiet at this hour, with only a few officers milling around. Ben's partner, Dave Reynolds, was at the front desk, going over paperwork. He looked up as Ben entered, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Ben, what the—" Dave started. But then his eyes landed on the children and his expression softened into one of concern. What happened? I found them out in the rain, Ben said, his voice tight with emotion. They were alone. No parents. No one. Dave's gaze shifted to Tyler, who stood silently beside Ben, his small body trembling slightly. Jesus, Dave muttered, running a hand through his hair. Are they okay? I don't know, Ben admitted. The babies are freezing. We need to warm them up. Dave nodded, moving quickly to grab blankets from the supply closet. Ben sat down in one of the chairs, carefully unwrapping the infants and draping the blankets over them. They were so tiny, their pale faces almost lost beneath the thick layers of fabric. Ben's heart clenched as he watched them, their fragility reminding him of Noah in those early days, when everything had been new, when the world had seemed so full of promise. But that promise had been shattered, and now here he was trying to save children who had been abandoned, just like his own hope had been abandoned the day Noah died. Ben shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't about Noah. This was about Tyler, Ethan, and Emma, about these children who needed help. Tyler stood by the door of the station, his small figure barely illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. Ben could see the dark circles under his eyes, the blankness in his expression, as if the boy was stuck somewhere far away in his mind. Ben had seen that look before, on the faces of people who had experienced too much for their years, people who had lost something vital and didn't know how to function without it. It wasn't the look of a child. It was the look of someone who had already had the weight of the world placed on their shoulders. Ben finished wrapping the babies in the blankets Dave had brought, ensuring they were warm enough, though their tiny bodies still felt chilled against his skin. He motioned for Tyler to come over, and after a hesitant pause, the boy shuffled forward, his feet dragging slightly as if the weight of his exhaustion was too much for him to bear. Hey, Tyler, Ben said gently, crouching down so he was eye level with the boy. Can you tell me a little more about what happened? Where are your parents? Tyler's eyes flicked to the floor, his small hands clenching at his sides. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and Ben didn't push him. He knew that trust wasn't something that came easily, especially for a kid who had been through as much as Tyler clearly had. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. They're gone, he said, his words simple and heavy at the same time. I don't have parents. I don't think I ever did. Ben's heart twisted. No child should have to carry that kind of truth, but Tyler said it like it was a fact, like it was something he had accepted long ago. Ben swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. Where were you before? Ben asked. Where did you come from? Tyler hesitated again, his small frame trembling slightly, as if he were trying to find the right words, or maybe the courage to speak them. His gaze flicked to the babies, and Ben could see the way his arms instinctively tightened around his own body, as though he were still holding them. We were at the orphanage, Tyler said finally, his voice barely audible. Miss Harper. She was supposed to take care of us, but she left us. Ben felt a chill crawl up his spine. An orphanage. The idea of a place meant to protect children abandoning them in the middle of a storm made his blood boil. He had encountered neglect before. He'd seen children slip through the cracks in the system, fall victim to circumstances no one should ever face. But this was different. This was deliberate abandonment, and that meant something was deeply wrong. She left you? Ben asked, his voice as calm as he could make it, though he felt the anger rising inside him. Tyler nodded, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he were remembering something painful. She said, there wasn't enough for all of us, and that we had too much trouble. So she took some kids and just left us there, in the rain. Ben's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. It took everything in him to keep his voice steady. How long were you out there? Tyler shrugged, his voice small. A long time. It was cold, The image of these children, left to fend for themselves in the rain, hit Ben like a punch to the gut. He could feel the protective instinct stirring inside him, the same instinct that had once driven him to be the best father he could be for Noah. But that instinct had been dormant for so long, buried under layers of grief and guilt. Now, it was coming back, and with it, the fierce need to keep these children safe. "Tyler, I promise you," Ben said, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I'm going to make sure you're safe. You and the babies. You're not alone anymore, okay?" Tyler didn't say anything, but Ben could see the way his shoulders relaxed just a fraction, the smallest sign that maybe, just maybe, he believed Ben's words. Ben stood up, his mind racing. He had to figure out what to do next. The first step was getting these kids somewhere warm and safe for the night. The next would be finding out exactly what was happening at that orphanage. Rachel's face was pale in the dim light of the house when Ben arrived, the familiar expression of grief etched across her features. She was sitting in her usual spot by the window, staring out into the rain, just as she had every night for the past year. The house was silent, save for the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, and the heaviness of that silence hung between them like a wall. Ben hadn't told her about the kids yet. He hadn't been sure how she would react, but now, as he stood in the doorway, holding 2 babies in his arms and with Tyler trailing behind him, he knew there was no avoiding it. He had to tell her, had to hope that somehow this could break through the impenetrable wall of grief that had separated them for so long. "Rachel," Ben said softly, his voice tentative. He stepped further into the room, the sound of his boots against the wooden floor startling in the quiet. Rachel didn't respond at first. She didn't even turn her head. But slowly, after what felt like an eternity, she shifted her gaze from the window to him. Her eyes, once bright with life, were now dull, distant. But when her gaze landed on the babies in Ben's arms, something flickered there. A spark of recognition, maybe. Or something deeper. Something Ben hadn't seen in a long time. What is this?" Rachel's voice was hoarse, as if it had barely been used in weeks. Her eyes moved from Ben's face to the tiny bundles in his arms, then to the small figure of Tyler standing in the doorway, his wide eyes watching her cautiously. Ben swallowed hard. He hadn't prepared himself for this moment, but there was no way around it now. He approached her slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might shatter the fragile moment. "I found them," Ben said, his voice low and gentle. "Out in the rain. They were alone. I couldn't leave them there." Rachel's eyes stayed fixed on the babies, her expression unreadable. Ben could see the turmoil behind her gaze, the way her hands trembled slightly in her lap as if she was fighting an internal battle. She hadn't touched a child, hadn't held one, since Noah. The fear of opening up again, of allowing herself to feel anything beyond her grief, was palpable in the way she stiffened, her body frozen in place. For a long moment, Rachel said nothing. Ben waited, holding his breath, watching her, unsure if this was the right thing to do. But then, slowly, Rachel's gaze softened. Her lips parted, and her hand moved hesitantly toward the baby closest to her fingers brushing against the soft, damp fabric of the blanket. "They're so small," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. She touched the baby's cheek gently, as if afraid the child might disappear if she pressed too hard. Ben exhaled, the tension in his chest releasing just slightly. It wasn't much, just a small movement, a tentative touch, but it was more than he had seen from Rachel in months. He hadn't expected a miracle, but this was something, a crack in the wall of grief that had separated them. "They're cold," Rachel murmured, her brows knitting together in concern as she stroked the baby's cheek again. "So cold." "I know," Ben said softly. "I've done my best to warm them up, but we need to get them settled for the night." Rachel's hand lingered on the baby's face for a moment longer before she finally pulled away, her expression uncertain. She looked up at Ben, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was something besides emptiness in her eyes. "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. It wasn't just a question about the babies. It was about everything. About their lives, their grief, their future. Ben knelt beside her, carefully placing the babies in the crib he had quickly set up before returning to the station. He could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, but he knew they couldn't afford to think too far ahead right now. "For tonight," Ben said, his voice steady, "we take care of them, one step at a time." Rachel nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. Ben could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of opening herself up to something new, of allowing herself to care again after the devastating loss of their son. But for the first time, he saw something else too. A small, fragile glimmer of hope. Tyler stood awkwardly in the living room, watching Ben and Rachel as they tended to the babies. He wasn't sure what to do, or where he was supposed to go. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, his eyes flitting from the crib to Rachel, who kept glancing at him but didn't say anything. Ben turned to Tyler and offered him a gentle smile, one that he hoped would reassure the boy. "Hey, Tyler," he said softly. "How are you feeling? Are you hungry?" Tyler shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling in a way that suggested he was trying to hide just how lost he felt. "I guess so." Ben motioned to the kitchen. "Come on. Let's get you something to eat." Tyler followed him hesitantly into the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. Ben opened the fridge, pulling out a loaf of bread and some peanut butter. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he figured Tyler could use something simple after the day he'd had. As Ben made the sandwich, Tyler stood by the counter, his eyes fixed on the floor. He seemed so small, so fragile, like a ghost of a child who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Ben couldn't imagine what the boy had been through, the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being unwanted. "You're safe here, Tyler," Ben said gently, cutting the sandwich in half and placing it on a plate. "You don't have to worry anymore." Tyler didn't respond right away. He took the plate from Ben and sat down at the table, staring at the sandwich for a long moment before finally picking it up. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Ben almost didn't hear him. "Are they going to stay with you?" Tyler asked. His eyes were still on the sandwich. Ben blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced back toward the living room where Rachel was sitting beside the crib, gently stroking the babies' heads. He hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered what the future would hold for these children, or for him and Rachel. All he knew was that he couldn't let them go back to whatever nightmare they had been living in. "I don't know," Ben admitted, sitting down across from Tyler, "but for now, they're safe, and we'll figure out the rest." Tyler nodded, though Ben could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. The boy had been abandoned before, left out in the cold without anyone to protect him. Ben could only imagine how hard it would be for him to trust him again, to believe that someone might actually want to keep him. But Ben made a silent promise to himself in that moment. He wasn't going to let Tyler, or the babies, slip through the cracks. He wasn't going to let them be forgotten. Later that night, after the house had finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Ben found himself sitting at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. Rachel was still downstairs, keeping a quiet vigil over the babies, and Tyler was asleep in the guest room. But Ben's mind was racing, unable to settle. He had spent the past year trying to avoid the pain of Noah's death, burying himself in work, distancing himself from Rachel and everything that reminded him of the life they had lost. But now, with these children in their home, something had shifted. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about him, about Rachel, about the possibility that they could find some way out of the darkness. Ben wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He wasn't sure if either of them were. But as he sat there, listening to the faint sounds of the babies breathing softly in the crib downstairs, he realized something important. Maybe it wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about taking the first step, even if you were scared, even if you didn't know what would come next. Ben stood up, his body heavy with exhaustion, and made his way back downstairs. Rachel was sitting in the armchair by the crib, her head resting on her hand, her eyes half closed. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was something different about her tonight, something that gave Ben hope. "They're asleep," Rachel whispered as Ben approached, her voice soft but clear. Ben nodded, sitting down on the couch beside her. For a long moment, they didn't say anything. The silence between them wasn't as heavy as it had been before. It was tentative, fragile, but not unbearable. "I'm scared, Ben," Rachel admitted finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can do this." Ben reached out, taking her hand in his. It was the first time they had touched each other in months, and the warmth of her skin against him sent a rush of emotions through him. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Ben said quietly. "We'll take it one day at a time." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. One day at a time. Ben squeezed her hand, and for the first time since Noah's death, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. Together. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the town. The air smelled fresh and clean, as if the rain had washed away some of the heaviness that had hung over everything the night before. Ben stood in the kitchen, watching the morning light spill through the window as he brewed a pot of coffee. The house was quiet, but there was a different kind of silence now, one that wasn't as oppressive, one that felt more like peace than emptiness. Rachel had gone upstairs to check on Tyler, who was still asleep, and the twins were settled in their crib, their tiny bodies curled up beneath the blankets. Ben felt a strange sense of calm as he stood there, sipping his coffee, watching the world outside slowly come back to life. He wasn't naive enough to believe that everything was fixed, that the grief and pain that had haunted them for so long would just disappear. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As he poured a second cup of coffee, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see Rachel standing in the doorway, her face tired but soft, her eyes a little brighter than they had been the night before. "How's Tyler?" Ben asked, handing her the cup. Rachel took it, cradling it in her hands as she leaned against the counter. "Still asleep. Poor kid must have been exhausted." Ben nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the night before. Tyler's words still echoed in his mind. We were too much trouble. The idea that anyone could see a child as a burden, as something disposable, made his blood boil. "We need to figure out what's really going on at that orphanage," Ben said, his voice firm. "I don't know what Miss Harper's been doing, but I'm going to find out." Rachel's expression hardened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. What if they try to take the kids back? Ben set his coffee down, reaching for her hand. "They're not taking them. Not after what they've been through. I won't let that happen." Rachel held his gaze, and for the first time Ben saw the same determination in her that he felt in himself. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. They would protect these children just as they had once protected Noah. Rachel stood in the kitchen, silently holding her coffee, her gaze drifting out the window as the sunlight fought to pierce through the lingering storm clouds. Her mind wandered back to the night before, to the moment she touched the baby's cheek. She hadn't expected the flood of emotions that came with it. The way that one simple act had shattered the numbing void she had built around herself after Noah's death. It had been the first time in months that she'd felt something beyond her grief. Something fragile and fleeting but undeniably real. The babies, Ethan and Emma, had been so cold, so small, so helpless. It was impossible not to feel a pang of maternal instinct as she cradled them in her arms. their soft breathing lulling her back to a time when she and Ben had cared for Noah. It had been so different then, filled with laughter, sleepless nights, and a love that had seemed unbreakable, but everything shattered so quickly. Noah's death had left her hollow, like a shell of the person she used to be. She had shut down, closing herself off from the world, and from Ben. She had let her grief consume her, wrapping herself in it like a protective blanket. But now, these children had sparked something she thought she'd lost forever. "What do we do next?" Rachel asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Ben looked at her, his expression one of careful contemplation. He had been thinking about that very question since the moment he found Tyler and the twins. His instincts as a cop told him to dig deeper into the orphanage, to investigate what was happening behind its doors. But his instincts as a father, though buried under layers of pain and loss, were telling him to protect these kids at all costs, no matter where that path might lead. "First, we keep them safe," Ben said, his voice steady but firm. "And then I'm going to look into that orphanage. I don't trust Miss Harper. Something's not right about any of this." Rachel nodded, though worry creased her brow. What if they try to take them back? Legally, they're still under the orphanage's care, right? They might think we're interfering. Ben's jaw clenched, and his eyes darkened with determination. "Let them try. We'll fight it. After what Tyler told me, I'm not letting those kids go back to that place. Not until we know the truth." Rachel leaned back against the counter, her mind swirling with uncertainty. The idea of getting attached to these children terrified her. She had already lost so much, and the thought of opening her heart again, only to lose them too, felt unbearable. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the way her heart had stirred when she held Ethan and Emma, or the way Tyler had looked at them with quiet desperation, as if begging for someone to care. "How are we going to explain this to social services?" Rachel asked, biting her lip. "We can't just keep them forever." Ben rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling slowly. "We'll figure it out. I'll talk to Dave. Maybe there's something we can do. Temporary custody or protective care until we get more answers." Rachel sighed, though the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Ben always had a way of making the impossible seem possible, and right now, she needed that. She needed to believe that they could protect these children, that they could be the safe harbor they so desperately needed. She glanced at the living room, where the babies were sleeping soundly in the crib, their tiny bodies curled up beneath the blankets, their faces peaceful in the soft morning light. It was such a stark contrast to the image she had conjured in her mind, the image of them out in the rain, abandoned and cold, with no one to care for them. Her heart ached for them, and despite her fears, she felt the walls around her grief begin to crack. Tyler's quiet voice broke through her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his small frame tense and uncertain, as if he were afraid to step further into the room. His clothes were still slightly damp from the night before, and his eyes, though wide and alert, held a wariness that no child should have to carry. Can I see the babies?" Tyler asked softly, his gaze darting from Rachel to Ben and back again. Rachel's heart clenched at the sound of his voice, so small, so fragile, and filled with the same kind of uncertainty that she had felt herself. She nodded, her lips curving into a soft, reassuring smile. "Of course," Rachel said gently. "Come on." Tyler hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped forward, his bare feet making barely a sound on the wooden floor. He approached the crib slowly, peering over the edge at the two tiny figures nestled inside. His expression softened, and for the first time, Rachel saw the boy behind the wariness, the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, the boy who had been left with nothing but fear and the responsibility of protecting two infants. "They're okay now," Tyler whispered, as if he needed to say it out loud to believe it. "They're not cold anymore." Rachel knelt beside him, her heart breaking at the tenderness in his voice. "They're safe now," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on Tyler's shoulder. "We're going to take care of them." Tyler glanced up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper. It was the look of a child who had been starved for love, for safety, for someone to tell him that he mattered. Rachel's heart swelled with emotion, and in that moment, she knew. No matter what happened, no matter how complicated things became, they had to protect these children. Ben stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He saw the way Rachel's hand rested on Tyler's shoulder, the way the boy seemed to relax ever so slightly in her presence. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, as if the pieces of their fractured lives were beginning to fit together again. He wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be easy from here on out. There were still so many questions, so many uncertainties about what would happen next. But for the first time in months, Ben felt like there was a path forward. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a way to live again, to rebuild, to heal, and to create something new out of the ashes of their old lives. "We'll figure this out," Ben said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "One step at a time." Rachel nodded, her hand still resting on Tyler's shoulder as they both gazed down at the sleeping babies. "One step at a time," she echoed, her voice soft but resolute. In that moment, surrounded by the fragile beginnings of hope, Ben and Rachel silently made a vow to each other and to the children who had come into their lives so unexpectedly. They would protect them, they would fight for them, and somehow, together, they would find a way to heal. The following days passed in a blur of quiet routines and tentative steps toward something resembling normalcy. The babies, Ethan and Emma, quickly became the center of Rachel's attention. She had spent so long retreating from life, hiding in her grief, that the act of caring for them felt both foreign and familiar. There was something soothing about the simple tasks, feeding them, changing them, rocking them to sleep. It was as though in caring for these tiny, helpless beings, she was slowly beginning to care for herself again. Tyler, meanwhile, remained a quiet presence in the house. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were short and hesitant. He stayed close to the babies, watching over them with a protective instinct that was far beyond his years. Rachel had caught him more than once gently stroking Emma's hair or murmuring soft reassurances to Ethan when he stirred in his sleep. It was clear that Tyler had taken on the role of caretaker long before Ben had found them. He had been forced to grow up too fast, to shoulder the responsibility of protecting his younger siblings, if not in blood, then in spirit. Rachel's heart ached for him, for the burden he had carried, and she found herself wanting to ease that weight, even if she wasn't sure how. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Rachel found Tyler sitting by the crib, his knees pulled up to his chest, his small frame silhouetted by the fading light from the window. The twins were asleep, their tiny breaths filling the room with a soft, rhythmic sound, but Tyler wasn't resting. He was watching them, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. Rachel approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the crib. "They're safe now," Rachel said gently, her voice soft in the quiet room. "You don't have to watch over them all the time." Tyler didn't respond right away. He kept his gaze fixed on the babies, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't want them to be alone," Tyler whispered after a long pause. "I don't want them to be cold again." Rachel's heart clenched at his words. She could hear the fear in his voice, the fear that at any moment the safety they had found here could be ripped away, that the warmth and comfort of this home could disappear just as quickly as it had come. "They won't be alone," Rachel said softly, her hand moving to rest gently on Tyler's shoulder. "We're here now. We'll take care of them, and we'll take care of you too." Tyler looked up at her then, his wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you really mean that? Rachel smiled, though there was a sadness behind it. She nodded, her voice steady. I mean it. You're safe here. We're going to make sure of that. For the first time since they had brought him into their home, Tyler's expression softened. It wasn't a smile, but it was something close, something that told Rachel he wanted to believe her, even if he wasn't sure how. It was a start, and for now, that was enough. Tyler's quiet acceptance of Rachel's words was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time in days that he hadn't seemed like a lost, frightened child trying to bear the weight of the world alone. Rachel's heart softened even more toward him, and the fierce protectiveness she felt for Ethan and Emma now extended fully to this boy who had carried too much for far too long. For a moment, they sat in silence. The soft rhythmic breathing of the babies filled the room, their peaceful slumber a reminder of the delicate balance they were all trying to maintain. Tyler rested his head against the side of the crib, his eyes half closed as if the exhaustion he'd been holding at bay was finally catching up to him. Rachel gently brushed a lock of hair out of Tyler's face, her fingers light against his skin. She didn't want to push him too far, too fast, but she felt a tug inside her to say more, to reach out to him in a way that she hadn't been able to reach out to anyone since Noah's death. You know, Rachel began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, when Noah was a baby, he had the same way of sleeping, curled up just like this. Tyler looked at her, his eyes blinking in the fading light of the room. He didn't say anything, but his gaze told Rachel that he was listening, that he wanted to know more. The fact that she had spoken Noah's name at all surprised her, but there was something about the stillness of the night, the weight of what they had all been through that made it feel safe to speak of him. He was always so peaceful when he slept, Rachel continued, a faint smile touching her lips as she remembered. But he would wake up at the smallest sound. He hated being alone too. I think most babies do. Tyler shifted slightly, his small body relaxing as Rachel spoke. She could see curiosity in his eyes now, the tentative interest that had replaced his earlier wariness. It was such a small step, but it felt important, like the first tentative thread of connection between them. What happened to him? Tyler asked quietly, his voice hesitant but clear. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to ask, hadn't expected to have this conversation with him. Not now, not so soon. But something in the way he asked made her feel like she owed him the truth, like maybe sharing a little of her pain would help him understand that he wasn't alone in his grief. He got sick, Rachel said softly, her voice trembling just slightly. We did everything we could, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try, it's not enough. Tyler's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. He didn't say anything, but Rachel could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was processing her words. I couldn't save him, Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. And it broke me, it broke both of us. Tyler's gaze dropped to the floor, and Rachel could feel the weight of the silence between them. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was a shared silence, one filled with the understanding of loss, of things that couldn't be fixed. She didn't expect Tyler to respond. He didn't need to. They both understood what it was to lose something you could never get back. I'm sorry, Tyler said quietly, his voice so soft that Rachel almost didn't hear him. Rachel smiled, though her heart ached with the weight of his words. Me too, sweetheart, she said gently. Me too. Ben stood just outside the nursery door, his arms crossed over his chest as he listened to the soft murmur of Rachel's voice. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when he'd come upstairs to check on them, he'd found himself rooted to the spot, unable to interrupt the quiet, intimate conversation unfolding between his wife and Tyler. Hearing Rachel talk about Noah, saying his name out loud, was like a punch to the gut. Ben had avoided bringing up their son for so long, afraid that the mention of him would shatter whatever fragile peace they'd managed to build since his death. But now, as he listened to Rachel share her grief with Tyler, he realized how much he had underestimated her. Rachel was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for, and maybe, just maybe, they were ready to start healing. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but one thing was clear. These children, Tyler, Ethan, and Emma, were now part of their lives whether they had planned for it or not. They couldn't turn away from them, couldn't just send them back to the orphanage and pretend this never happened. Ben knew deep down that these children had entered their lives for a reason. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a second chance for both him and Rachel. Ben sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as he tried to shake off the weight of his thoughts. He had promised Rachel that they would take it one step at a time, but he couldn't ignore the urgency gnawing at him. Something wasn't right at that orphanage, and every time he thought about Miss Harper leaving these children out in the rain, his gut twisted with anger. He needed to do something about it. He couldn't just stand by and hope things worked out. He had to take action, had to dig deeper into what was happening at that place. But he also knew that he had to be careful. If he pushed too hard, too fast, Miss Harper might catch wind of his investigation, and there was no telling what she might do if she felt threatened. Ben glanced at his watch, noting that it was still early in the evening. He had time to do some research, time to gather more information. He would start by going through the orphanage's records, looking for any discrepancies or signs of wrongdoing. And if that didn't turn up anything, he would pay Miss Harper a visit himself. He turned away from the door, heading downstairs to his office. His mind was already racing with ideas, plans forming as he mentally pieced together the puzzle of Tyler and the baby's abandonment. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and when it did, Ben would be ready. Later that night, after Ben had retreated to his office and Tyler had fallen asleep on the couch, Rachel found herself standing in the crib watching Ethan and Emma sleep. The soft glow of the nightlight bathed the room in a warm, golden light, and the rhythmic rise and fall of the babies' chests filled the space with a sense of peace that Rachel hadn't felt in a long time. She had always loved watching Noah sleep, had found comfort in the quiet moments when the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of her son's gentle breathing. Those moments had been a refuge for her, a reminder of the pure, unbreakable bond between mother and child. But now, standing here with these babies, these children who weren't hers by blood but had somehow found their way into her heart, Rachel felt a new kind of connection forming. It terrified her. She had spent so long trying to avoid the pain, trying to keep herself from feeling too much. Letting herself love these children, letting herself care for them, felt like opening up a wound that had only just begun to scab over. What if something happened to them? What if they were taken away? What if she lost them, just like she had lost Noah? The fear was suffocating, but so was the idea of turning away from them. She couldn't bear the thought of letting them go, of abandoning them the way the system had already abandoned them once. These children needed her, and though she was still afraid to admit it, she needed them too. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the crib as she tried to sort through the tangled mess of emotions inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. She couldn't run from this. She couldn't hide from the responsibility, from the love that was already growing inside her heart. She would have to face it, just like Ben had said, one step at a time. The next morning, Ben woke up early, his mind still buzzing with the questions that had kept him awake for most of the night. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was off about Miss Harper's orphanage, and the more he thought about it, the more determined he became to find out what was really going on. He had spent part of the night combing through the police database, looking for any reports or complaints related to the orphanage. What he found was unsettling. There had been several reports filed over the past few years, claims of neglect, missing children, and even allegations of abuse. But none of them had gone anywhere. Every time the cases had been closed without further investigation, dismissed as unsubstantiated or lack of evidence. It didn't sit right with Ben. How could so many complaints be ignored? How could so many children fall through the cracks? He had reached out to Dave Reynolds, his partner, and asked him to pull some additional records. Background checks on Miss Harper, financial records for the orphanage, anything that might give them a clue as to what was really happening behind closed doors. He was still waiting to hear back, but in the meantime, Ben had decided to pay Miss Harper another visit. This time, he wouldn't be playing the role of concerned officer. This time, he was going in as an investigator, and he wasn't leaving without answers. Rachel stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as the morning light streamed through the window. She looked tired, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there in a long time. A glimmer of hope, maybe. Or at least the beginnings of it. "Are you heading out?" Rachel asked, her voice groggy as she stretched. Ben nodded, sitting up and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "Yeah, I'm going to check out the orphanage again. I need to talk to Miss Harper." Rachel frowned, propping herself up on one elbow. "Do you think she'll tell you anything?" Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I have to try. Something's not right about that place, Rachel. I can feel it." Rachel was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "Just be careful, Ben. I don't trust her." Ben nodded, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "I will. I'll be back as soon as I can." Rachel watched him leave, her heart heavy with both concern and gratitude. She knew Ben was doing this for the children, but she also knew that, in some way, he was doing it for himself, for them. He was trying to fix something that felt unfixable, trying to protect these children in the way he hadn't been able to protect Noah, and in doing so, he was slowly finding his way back to her. Ben pulled up outside the orphanage just after noon, the midday sun casting long shadows across the front lawn. The building looked as unassuming as ever, old, weather-worn, and in desperate need of repairs. It was hard to believe that such a place could be hiding something sinister, but Ben had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. He climbed out of the car, squinting against the glare of the sun as he made his way to the front door. The air was heavy with humidity, the lingering remnants of last night's storm still clinging to the atmosphere. Ben knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet yard, and waited. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Miss Harper appeared. Her thin, bony frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. She looked as composed as ever, her sharp eyes scanning Ben with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Officer Williams," Miss Harper said, her voice cool and clipped. "What brings you back here?" Ben forced a polite smile, though his gut churned with distrust. "I wanted to follow up on the children we found. I'd like to ask you a few more questions about how they ended up on the street." Miss Harper's expression didn't change, but Ben saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something dark and calculating. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "We can talk inside." Ben stepped across the threshold, his senses on high alert as he entered the orphanage. Something about this place felt off, and he was determined to figure out what it was. Ben stepped into the orphanage, the air inside heavy with the musty scent of damp wood and stale dust. The front hallway was dimly lit, with flickering bulbs casting long, uneven shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The house felt just as it had during his last visit, old and neglected, as if it had been abandoned by time. But now, knowing what Tyler had told him, knowing that this place had left those children to fend for themselves, it felt different. Darker. Miss Harper led him down the hallway, her back rigid and her steps precise. Ben followed closely, his eyes scanning every detail. The worn floorboards, the faded pictures on the walls, the chipped paint on the door frames. It was all surface-level neglect, but Ben's gut told him that what lay beneath was far worse. She led him into a small office at the back of the house. It was cramped and cluttered, with old papers stacked on every available surface, and a musty smell that reminded Ben of basements and forgotten attics. A large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, and behind it, a single window let in a sliver of daylight. Miss Harper motioned for Ben to sit as she took her place behind the desk, her bony fingers lacing together on top of a stack of old, yellowed papers. "You said you had more questions," she said, her voice clipped and professional. Her eyes, however, told a different story. There was something cold and calculated in the way she looked at him, something that set Ben's teeth on edge. Ben nodded, sitting down in the rickety chair across from her. He kept his face neutral, his tone even, but inside, his mind was racing with questions. He needed to tread carefully here, to get her talking without making her suspicious. "Yes," Ben said slowly, folding his hands in his lap. "I'm trying to piece together how Tyler, Ethan, and Emma ended up outside in the middle of that storm. I've spoken to Tyler, but I want to hear your side of the story." Miss Harper's expression didn't change, but Ben noticed the way her hands tightened slightly on the edge of the desk, her knuckles whitening for just a moment before she relaxed again. "Officer Williams," she said, her tone carefully measured. "This orphanage has been struggling for years. We don't have the resources we need. We're severely understaffed, and sometimes things slip through the cracks. The children you found, they were supposed to be taken to a family, but plans fell through, and we couldn't keep them here any longer." Ben's jaw clenched. The cool detachment in her voice made it clear that she didn't see these children as individuals, as people. To her, they were burdens, problems that needed to be solved, tossed aside when they no longer served a purpose. His grip tightened on the arms of the chair, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So, you just left them outside?" Ben asked, keeping his tone steady but firm. "In the middle of a storm?" Miss Harper's eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of irritation flashing in her gaze. "It wasn't ideal, but there were no other options at the time. We do the best we can with what we have, Officer Williams." Her words rang hollow, and Ben could feel his temper rising. He knew there was more to this. There had to be. No decent person would abandon children like that, and her dismissive attitude was only making him more suspicious. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "Tyler told me that children have disappeared from this orphanage before. He said some kids just don't come back." Miss Harper's face remained impassive, but Ben could see the way her eyes flickered with something darker, something that she was trying to hide. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Ben to notice. "Children leave here all the time," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "They're adopted by families, or they're transferred to other facilities. We keep thorough records of every child's placement." "Can I see those records?" Ben asked, his tone sharp now, leaving no room for her to maneuver. Miss Harper's smile was tight, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Of course," she said, her voice icy. "I'll have to retrieve them from our files, but as I said, everything is documented. We have nothing to hide." Ben nodded, his mind racing as she rose from the desk and left the room to retrieve the records. He knew something was wrong here, and he was determined to find out what it was. If Miss Harper was involved in something more sinister, if she was lying about these children's whereabouts, then he needed to gather evidence, and fast. Back at home, Rachel sat with Tyler on the living room floor, the sound of soft children's music playing in the background as she tried to get him to open up. Ethan and Emma were nearby, rolling around on a playmat, their giggles filling the room with the kind of warmth that Rachel had almost forgotten existed. But Tyler wasn't laughing. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, his small body tense, his eyes fixed on the twins, but not really seeing them. He had been distant all morning, his usual quietness now heavy with something darker, something that worried Rachel deeply. "Tyler," Rachel said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "You don't have to watch over them all the time. They're safe here." Tyler glanced at her, his brow furrowed, but he didn't respond. His arms stayed tightly wrapped around his knees, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing himself for something bad to happen. Rachel's heart ached for him. She knew what it was like to feel that kind of fear. The fear that at any moment, everything could be ripped away, leaving only emptiness in its wake. She had lived with that fear ever since Noah's death, and she recognized it in Tyler now, in the way he clung to control because it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "You're not alone anymore," Rachel said gently, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Ben and we're going to take care of you. We're not going anywhere." Tyler's gaze flickered, and for a moment, Rachel saw something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, of hope. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar wariness that had become a part of him. "They always say that," Tyler muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "But they never stay." Rachel felt her chest tight. She didn't know the full extent of what Tyler had been through, what kind of abandonment and neglect he had faced, but she could hear the pain in his voice, the way it broke with the weight of all the promises that had been made and broken. She wanted to tell him that this time was different, that they wouldn't leave him, that he was safe here, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Tyler had been let down too many times, and trust wasn't something that could be given freely anymore. So instead, Rachel simply sat with him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, offering him the only thing she could, her presence. She didn't push him to talk, didn't try to force him to open up. She just stayed, letting him know that for now he wasn't alone. Ben waited in Miss Harper's office, his mind racing with possibilities. If what Tyler had said was true, if children had disappeared from the orphanage without a trace, then there had to be a paper trail, some kind of clue that would reveal what was really going on. Miss Harper returned a few minutes later, a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on the desk in front of Ben, her face composed but her eyes sharp, watching him carefully. "Here are the records," she said, her voice cold. "You'll see that everything is in order." Ben opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. There were names, dates, and lists of children who had supposedly been adopted or transferred to other facilities. At first glance, it all seemed legitimate. Clean, organized, as if Miss Harper had nothing to hide. But Ben had been a cop long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. He flipped through the pages, looking for any inconsistencies, any gaps in the timeline that might suggest something was off. And then, about halfway through the file, he found it. Several children's records were incomplete, missing details about their supposed adoptions, no addresses listed for the families who had taken them in. Ben's heart raced. This was it, proof that Miss Harper was hiding something. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. "These records don't match up," he said, his voice hard. "There are children here with no adoption details, no contact information for their new families. Can you explain that?" Miss Harper's expression didn't falter, but Ben could see the flicker of annoyance behind her eyes. She was losing her patience, and it was becoming harder for her to keep up the facade. "Those were special cases," she said, her voice tight. "The adoptions were private, and the families requested anonymity." Ben's stomach churned. He knew a lie when he heard one. "And you didn't think to mention that earlier?" Ben pressed, his voice low. "You left children outside in the rain, and now you're telling me that you've been facilitating private adoptions without proper documentation." Miss Harper's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold. "You have no idea how difficult it is to run a place like this, Officer Williams. We do what we have to do to survive. Sometimes that means bending the rules." Ben's blood boiled at her admission. Bending the rules? These were children's lives she was talking about, innocent kids who had been abandoned, neglected, and in some cases, possibly worse. He had to find out where those missing children had gone. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be back," he said, his voice cold. "And when I return, I'll have more than just questions." Miss Harper's expression hardened, but she didn't say anything as Ben turned and walked out of the office. He could feel her eyes on him, the weight of her gaze heavy with anger and resentment. But Ben didn't care. He was getting closer to the truth, and he wasn't going to stop until he had enough evidence to bring Miss Harper down. Ben left the orphanage, his mind buzzing with the information he had just uncovered. The missing details in the adoption records, Miss Harper's thinly veiled lies, and the sense that there was something far more sinister going on behind the scenes. It all pointed to something bigger, something darker. He needed more than just a gut feeling, though. He needed solid proof. As he drove back home, his phone buzzed in the passenger seat. It was a message from Dave Reynolds, his partner at the station. Ben picked up the phone and quickly read the text, got the background info on Harper and the orphanage. "You need to see this." Ben's heart quickened. He'd known something was off, but if Dave had uncovered something that backed up his suspicions, they were one step closer to taking Harper down. When Ben pulled into the driveway, he saw Rachel standing by the front window, watching the twins play on the floor. He parked the car, feeling the weight of everything bearing down on him. He needed to share what he'd uncovered with Rachel, but first, he had to get to the station and see what Dave had found. Ben sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary, letting the weight of everything settle in. His heart was still pounding from the confrontation with Miss Harper, the thin veneer of professionalism she wore barely hiding the lies underneath. He could see it now. This wasn't just about incompetence or neglect. It was something far worse, something that ran deeper than he'd anticipated. But he needed more than gut instincts and half-truths. He needed proof. He glanced back at the house where Rachel was tending to Ethan and Emma. Tyler was still with her, his tiny form barely visible from this distance. Ben's heart softened at the sight. His family was starting to come together in ways he hadn't imagined when he first brought those children home, but the looming investigation meant that their fragile peace could shatter at any moment, especially if Harper's influence went deeper than just the orphanage. A text from his partner Dave Reynolds had come through during the drive back, and Ben's fingers tightened around his phone as he read it again. Got the background info on Harper and the orphanage. "You need to see this." Ben exhaled sharply, already feeling the pressure of what was to come. If they could expose Miss Harper and shut down whatever operation she was running, it would keep Tyler, Ethan, and Emma safe. But it would also drag his family into a dark, tangled mess of corruption and crime. And if Miss Harper caught wind of what they were planning, she might go to desperate lengths to protect herself. Ben climbed out of the car and stepped into the house, the familiar warmth of the home greeting him. Rachel looked up from where she was sitting with the twins, a hint of worry flashing across her face as he entered. Tyler sat quietly beside her, playing with a set of wooden blocks, his small hands carefully stacking them one on top of the other. "Hey," Rachel said softly, standing as Ben approached. "How did it go?" Ben glanced at Tyler, who was watching them from the corner of his eye. He didn't want to alarm the boy by sharing the details of what he'd found at the orphanage, not yet at least. Instead, he gave Rachel a small, reassuring smile and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm going to the station," Ben said quietly. "Dave's found something. Something big. I don't want to say too much until I know more." Rachel's brow furrowed, concern deepening the lines around her eyes. "Is it about the kids?" Ben nodded, glancing at the twins who were blissfully unaware of the tension that hung in the air. Ethan was babbling to himself, his chubby hands waving in the air, while Emma rolled over, giggling. Tyler, on the other hand, was more withdrawn, quietly watching over the babies as though his entire existence depended on keeping them safe. Ben placed a gentle hand on Rachel's arm. I'll be back soon. I just need to see what Dave has. Rachel bit her lip, hesitating. Be careful, Ben. I don't trust Miss Harper. There's something wrong about her. I know, Ben said, his voice firm. I'll get to the bottom of it. He turned to leave, but Rachel's voice stopped him. Ben, she called, her voice soft but steady. Whatever happens, we can't let them take these kids back there. I don't care what we have to do. Ben met her eyes, his heart heavy. He knew what she was asking. He knew how deeply Rachel had already bonded with these children, how much they had come to mean to her, and he felt the same. He would do whatever it took to protect them. I won't let that happen, Ben promised. The police station was unusually quiet when Ben arrived. The usual buzz of voices and ringing phones had been replaced by a low murmur of activity, as if the storm outside had dampened the usual chaos. Ben walked straight through to Dave's office, his mind racing with questions. When he entered, Dave was sitting at his desk, a stack of folders and papers spread out in front of him. His face was grim as he looked up at Ben. You're not going to like this, Dave said, without preamble, pushing one of the folders toward him. Ben took a seat, his pulse quickening as he opened the file. Inside were several reports, financial documents, personnel records, and a series of complaints filed against Miss Harper and the orphanage over the past few years. It didn't take long for Ben to realize that what he was looking at wasn't just a case of neglect or mismanagement. It was something far worse. Harper's been involved in this for a while, Dave said, his voice low. There are reports of kids going missing, families who supposedly adopted them but can't be traced, and financial irregularities that don't add up. It looks like she's been funneling money into some kind of illegal operation. Ben's jaw tightened. Human trafficking? Dave nodded grimly. That's what it looks like. And she's been smart about it. Covering her tracks, bribing people, keeping everything under the radar. But some of the families who adopted the kids started asking questions when the adoptions weren't finalized. Those kids disappeared after that. Ben felt a sickening weight settle in his stomach. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Miss Harper wasn't just neglecting children, she was selling them, exploiting their vulnerability, and covering it all up with the pretense of running an orphanage. Why hasn't anyone done anything about this? Ben asked, anger rising in his chest. How has she gotten away with it for so long? She's got connections, Dave explained, flipping through the documents. It looks like she's got a few powerful people on her side, people who've been helping her keep this operation quiet. But there's more. Some of the kids she placed with families were never officially adopted. No records, no paperwork, nothing. Ben clenched his fists. Tyler, Ethan, and Emma had been victims of this system, abandoned in the rain because they didn't fit into Miss Harper's plans. And now, more than ever, Ben was determined to protect them. What do we do now? Ben asked, his voice tight with resolve. Dave looked at him, his expression was hard. We build a case, we gather evidence, real, solid evidence, and we take her down. But we have to be careful. If Harper finds out we're onto her, she could disappear before we have enough to charge her. Ben nodded, his mind racing. They had to move quickly but strategically. If they could get the right evidence, records, witness testimonies, anything that linked Harper to the trafficking operation, they could shut her down for good. There's one more thing, Dave said, pulling out a final piece of paper from the stack. I looked into the kids you brought in, Tyler, Ethan, and Emma. Harper never registered them properly. There's no record of them being placed in the orphanage, no documentation at all. It's like they don't exist in the system. Ben's heart sank. What does that mean for them? Dave sighed. Legally, they don't belong to anyone, which means Harper can't come after them, not officially, at least. But it also means they're vulnerable. If we don't get this sorted soon, someone could try to take them back. or worse. Ben's stomach twisted at the thought. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let those kids fall back into the hands of the very system that had abandoned them. "Let's get started," Ben said, his voice hard with determination. "We're bringing her down." When Ben returned home later that evening, the sky had darkened and the first signs of another storm were beginning to gather on the horizon. He parked the car and made his way inside, his mind still reeling from the day's discoveries. Every step brought him closer to the reality of what they were facing, a battle not just against Miss Harper, but against a whole system that had failed these children. Rachel met him at the door, her face etched with concern. "What did Dave find?" she asked, her voice quiet but tense. Ben took a deep breath, pulling her into the living room where Tyler, Ethan, and Emma were playing on the floor. He glanced at the children, his heart heavy, and then turned to Rachel. "It's worse than we thought," Ben said, his voice low. "Miss Harper, she's been involved in trafficking, selling kids under the radar, making them disappear, and there's no record of Tyler or the twins ever being officially placed in her care." Rachel's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" Ben nodded, his face grim. "We have enough to start building a case, but it's going to take time. And until then, those kids are still vulnerable." Rachel's gaze flicked to the children, her heart breaking at the thought of what they had already been through, and what could still happen if they weren't careful. She knelt beside the twins, who were giggling as they played with a set of soft toys and gently stroked their hair. "We have to protect them, Ben," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't let them go back. We can't." Ben knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We won't," he promised. "I swear Rachel will keep them safe." Rachel nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The thought of losing these children, the thought of them being taken away or worse, was too much to bear. But they had no choice now. They had to fight for the kids, for their future, for their family. The rain had returned by the time Ben awoke the next morning, pounding against the roof like a drumbeat, signaling the tension that had settled into every corner of his life. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, his mind still swirling with revelations from the night before. Miss Harper was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined, and the fact that there were no official records of Tyler, Ethan, or Emma meant the kids were in even more danger than he'd feared. Rachel was already downstairs with the kids when Ben finally pulled himself out of bed. The familiar sounds of Ethan's babbling and Emma's giggles echoed through the house, along with the soft murmur of Rachel's voice as she spoke to Tyler. Ben's heart clenched at the thought of what they had all been through, and what might still lie ahead. As he made his way downstairs, the weight of everything pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had promised Rachel that they would keep the kids safe, but now it felt like they were up against something far bigger than just one corrupt woman. Miss Harper's connections ran deep, and there was no telling how far she'd go to protect herself if she realized they were closing in on her. When Ben reached the living room, Rachel was sitting on the floor with the twins, her attention focused on Tyler, who sat beside her, quietly watching the rain through the window. "Morning," Ben said softly as he entered the room, his gaze shifting between the kids and Rachel. Rachel looked up, her face etched with the same concern she'd had the night before. "Hey," she said quietly. "How are you holding up?" Ben shrugged, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, we're close to something, but I'm worried Harper's going to catch on before we can act." Rachel nodded, her eyes darting at the kids. "What if she tries to take them back? Or worse, what if she tries to disappear before you can stop her?" Ben's jaw clenched. That thought had been gnawing at him all night. Miss Harper wasn't just a negligent caregiver. She was actively involved in something criminal, something that endangered every child in her care. The fact that Tyler and the twins had survived at all felt like a miracle, but he knew they couldn't rely on luck any longer. "We need to act fast," Ben said, his voice firm. Dave and I are working on getting a warrant to search the orphanage, but it's going to take time. Until then, we have to keep a low profile. If Harper suspects we're onto her, she might try to take drastic measures." Rachel bit her lip, her hand gently brushing over Ethan's soft curls as he played with a toy. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect them, Ben. I can't lose them. Not after everything." Ben's heart twisted at the emotion in Rachel's voice. She had already lost so much. After Noah's death, it had felt like they would never recover, like the weight of their grief would crush them both. But these kids, these vulnerable, innocent children, had breathed life back into their home, giving them a reason to keep going, to keep fighting. "We won't lose them," Ben said firmly, moving closer to Rachel and placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. She nodded slowly, though the fear in her expression didn't fade. "Okay. We'll be ready for whatever comes." Ben headed back to the station later that morning, his mind focused on the task ahead. He and Dave needed to gather as much evidence as possible if they were going to bring Miss Harper down. The missing children, the falsified records, the illegal adoptions all pointed to something far more sinister than a poorly run orphanage. And the sooner they exposed it, the sooner they could ensure that no more children would suffer in their hands. When Ben arrived, Dave was already waiting for him, a grim look on his face as he handed over another stack of documents. "I did some more digging last night," Dave said, flipping through the papers as Ben took a seat across from him. "I found records of large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts under Harper's name. It's not just the orphanage. It looks like she's been running a side business, selling kids to wealthy families who want to bypass the legal adoption process." Ben's stomach turned. He had suspected it, but hearing the confirmation made it feel all the more real, and all the more horrifying. "Jesus," Ben muttered, running a hand over his face. "How many kids are we talking about?" "At least a dozen over the past 5 years," Dave said, his expression grim. "But it could be more. There are gaps in the paperwork, discrepancies that suggest some kids never made it into the official system at all." Ben's blood boiled as he processed the information. Miss Harper had been using the orphanage as a front, selling children to the highest bidder while pretending to run a legitimate organization. And the worst part? She'd been getting away with it for years. "What's our next move?" Ben asked, his voice tight with anger. Dave leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he considered their options. "We need that warrant, but it's going to take time to get approval. In the meantime, we could try talking to some of the families who adopted kids from the orphanage. See if any of them noticed anything suspicious." Ben nodded. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something, and it might give them the evidence they needed to get the warrant faster. "We'll split up," Ben said, standing. "I'll take the north side of town, you take the south. We'll start with the families who've adopted recently and work our way back." Dave nodded, grabbing his jacket as he stood. "Be careful, Ben. Harper's got people watching her back. If she gets wind of what we're doing, she won't hesitate to shut it all down and disappear." Ben's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let that happen. While Ben was out gathering evidence, Rachel stayed home with the children, trying to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the twins' playful giggles or Tyler's quiet presence, her thoughts kept returning to the looming threat of Miss Harper. She couldn't shake the fear that at any moment someone might come to take the children away. Legally, she and Ben had no rights over them. They were still wards of the state, or at least that's what the system would say. And if Miss Harper found out they were investigating her, who knew what kind of strings she might pull to cover her tracks? Rachel sat on the floor with Emma in her lap, watching as Ethan crawled toward a brightly colored toy. Her heart swelled with love for these children. Children who had come into her life so unexpectedly but had filled the void left by Noah's death in ways she hadn't thought possible. But with that love came fear. Fear that they would be taken away. Fear that she would lose them, just as she had lost Noah. The thought of it sent a shiver down her spine. Tyler sat nearby, watching her with quiet intensity. He had grown more comfortable in their home over the past few days, but Rachel could see the lingering shadows of fear in his eyes. He had been through so much, and the weight of that trauma was evident in the way he kept to himself, always staying close to the babies as if he were their protector. Rachel reached out to him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "How are you doing, Tyler?" she asked softly. Tyler shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "Okay, I guess." Rachel's heart ached for him. She could see how hard he was trying to be strong, to keep everything bottled up inside. But she also knew that, eventually, those walls would have to come down. "You know," Rachel said gently, "it's okay to be scared. I get scared too." Tyler's gaze flickered to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You do?" Rachel nodded, her voice soft but steady. "Of course. I'm scared of losing you and the babies. I'm scared that something bad might happen. But it's okay to feel that way. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you care." Tyler was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching for hers as if trying to decide whether he could trust her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice small and hesitant. "I'm scared that if we leave here, no one will take care of us," he whispered, "that they'll forget about us." Rachel's heart clenched. She pulled Tyler closer, wrapping an arm around his small shoulders as she spoke softly. "I promise you, Tyler, that won't happen. We won't let it. Ben and I will fight for you. You're part of our family now." Tyler looked up at her, his eyes wide and filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you mean it?" Rachel smiled, though her heart ached for him. "I mean it, sweetheart. We're going to protect you, no matter what." Ben's day was long and frustrating, filled with dead-end conversations and families who either didn't want to talk or claimed they hadn't noticed anything suspicious about the orphanage. But as the afternoon wore on, he finally caught a break. He arrived at a modest house on the outskirts of town where a couple in their late 40s had recently adopted a young girl from the orphanage. At first, they seemed reluctant to talk, but when Ben mentioned Miss Harper's name, something changed. The woman, Mrs. Keller, hesitated, glancing nervously at her husband before speaking. We always thought something was strange about that place," Mrs. Keller said quietly. "The adoption process was so rushed. Miss Harper barely gave us any time to get to know our daughter before the papers were signed." Ben leaned forward, his heart racing. "Did she ever mention why?" Mrs. Keller shook her head. "No, but there were other things too. Our daughter Lily, she never talks about the orphanage. Every time we ask, she shuts down. It's like she's afraid to even think about it." Ben's gut tightened. "Did she say anything about other kids? Anyone who might have disappeared?" Mrs. Keller's eyes widened, her face paling as she realized the implications of Ben's question. "There were rumors we heard from other families that some of the children who were supposed to be adopted just vanished." Ben nodded, his pulse quickening. This was the break they needed. The missing children, the rushed adoptions, all pointed to the trafficking ring he and Dave suspected. "Thank you for telling me this," Ben said, his voice steady. "You've been a huge help." Mrs. Keller nodded, her eyes filled with worry. "Please, Officer Williams, if what you're saying is true, you need to stop her. You need to protect those kids." Ben stood, his resolve hardening. "I will. I promise." By the time Ben returned home that evening, the storm outside had intensified. The wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows as he pulled into the driveway. His heart was still pounding from the conversation with the Kellers, the weight of their testimony pressing heavily on him.
He stepped inside, soaked from the rain, and found Rachel waiting for him in the living room. The twins were already asleep, their soft breathing filling the quiet space, while Tyler sat curled up on the couch, his eyes half closed as he watched the flickering shadows on the walls. Ben shook off his wet jacket and sat beside Rachel, his mind still racing. "I talked to one of the families today. They confirmed what we suspected. Kids have been disappearing and the adoptions are being rushed." Rachel's eyes widened. "So it's true. The trafficking."
Ben nodded grimly. "Yeah, and Harper's been covering her tracks for years. But we're getting close to having enough evidence to bring her down." Rachel glanced at Tyler, who had drifted off to sleep, his small body curled up under a blanket. Her heart ached at the sight of him, so vulnerable yet so strong. "What happens next?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We keep pushing," Ben said, his voice resolute. "Dave and I are getting closer. Once we have enough, we'll get that warrant and shut her down for good." Rachel nodded, her hand tightening around Ben's. "Whatever happens, Ben, we have to protect these kids. We can't let them go back." "We won't," Ben promised, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to stop her." The storm outside raged on, filling the night with the roar of wind and the relentless patter of rain against the windows. Inside the house, the atmosphere was quieter, but the tension was palpable. Rachel had tucked the twins into their crib and was now sitting on the couch, a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she watched Tyler sleep nearby. His small body was curled up tightly, his face relaxed for the first time in days. She couldn't stop thinking about what Ben had told her earlier. The trafficking, the missing children, the nightmare that Miss Harper had created. It was almost too much to comprehend, and yet, it explained everything. The children who had disappeared, the rushed adoptions, the cold detachment in Harper's eyes when she talked about the kids in her care. Rachel had known deep down that something was wrong the moment she first laid eyes on the woman, but the reality of it was so much worse than she could have imagined. Ben entered the room quietly, his hair still damp from the rain. He had been on the phone with Dave for the past hour, strategizing their next steps. He sat down beside Rachel, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing heavily on him. "We're almost there," Ben said, his voice low but determined. "Dave is getting the warrant expedited. By tomorrow morning, we should have what we need to search the orphanage." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding. "And then what?" "What if Harper tries to run?" "We'll have her surrounded," Ben assured her. "She won't get far." Rachel exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had been trying to stay strong for the children, but the fear was starting to creep in. She knew what was at stake now, knew how easily things could go wrong, and the thought of losing Tyler, Ethan, and Emma, of them being pulled back into the hell they had escaped, was unbearable. "Do you really think we'll be able to keep them?" Rachel asked, her voice soft, but laden with fear. Ben's gaze softened as he looked at her. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I don't know what the courts will say, but I do know this. We're their family now, Rachel. You and me. They're not going anywhere without a fight." Rachel's throat tightened with emotion, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't want them to go back into the system, Ben. I can't lose them." "You won't," Ben said firmly. "We'll figure it out." Rachel nodded, though the worry in her chest didn't subside. She glanced over at Tyler, his small body curled up under the blanket. The little boy who had been through so much already. She couldn't let him go back into the system, not after what they had been through together. But as the hours ticked by, a creeping sense of dread filled the room. There was still so much they didn't know about Miss Harper's operation, and the thought of what could be hiding within those walls sent chills down Rachel's spine. "I hate that we have to wait," Rachel whispered, leaning into Ben. "What if something happens before we can stop her?" Ben squeezed her hand gently. "We're keeping a close watch. Nothing's going to happen tonight. Harper doesn't know we're this close. She won't see it coming." Rachel nodded, though the unease still lingered. She trusted Ben, trusted that he and Dave were doing everything they could to bring Miss Harper to justice. But deep down, a part of her feared that Harper had more tricks up her sleeve than they realized. Tyler stirred in his sleep, his small body shifting restlessly on the couch. Rachel watched him for a moment, her heart aching as she imagined the kind of nightmares that must have haunted him since leaving the orphanage. He had been so brave, taking care of Ethan and Emma, protecting them when no one else would. But he was still just a child, and no child should have to bear the weight of such responsibility. Rachel stood and walked over to him, gently tucking the blanket around his shoulders. As she did, Tyler's eyes fluttered open, his brow furrowing in confusion as he blinked up at her. "Rachel?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm right here," Rachel said softly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You're safe." Tyler blinked, his gaze slowly coming into focus. "I had a dream," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We were back at the orphanage, but it was different." Rachel knelt beside him, her heart heavy. "What happened in the dream?" Tyler hesitated, his small hands clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. "Miss Harper. She was mad. She said we didn't belong here. She tried to take Ethan and Emma away." Rachel's heart clenched at the fear in his voice. She leaned in closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "That's not going to happen, Tyler. You're safe here. We won't let anyone take you or the babies away." Tyler looked up at her, his wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if they come for us? What if Miss Harper finds us?" Rachel felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "We won't let that happen, sweetheart. Ben's working on it. He's going to make sure Miss Harper can't hurt you ever again." Tyler stared at her for a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether he could believe her. Then, slowly, he nodded, though the fear in his eyes didn't completely fade. Rachel pulled him into a gentle hug, holding him close as the rain continued to pound against the windows. She knew that nothing she said would completely erase the trauma of what he had been through, but she hoped that, in time, he would begin to feel safe again. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside drenched but calm. The sky was still overcast, but there was a quietness in the air that felt almost peaceful, as if the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Ben had barely slept the night before. His mind had been too consumed with the investigation, with the questions still left unanswered. Now, as he stood in the kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee, he mentally prepared himself for what the day would bring. Dave had called earlier, confirming that the warrant was in place. They were set to raid the orphanage in the early afternoon, and Ben knew that once they stepped foot inside, everything would change. It was their chance to expose Miss Harper, to bring her operation crashing down. But it was also dangerous. If Harper realized what was happening before they had enough evidence, she could destroy everything, disappear with the money, the records, and any trace of the missing children. As Ben stood at the kitchen counter, Rachel came down the stairs, her face drawn but determined. She had stayed up late with Tyler, finally getting him back to sleep after his nightmare. "How are you feeling?" Ben asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Rachel gave him a small, weary smile. "Tired, but I'm ready. We need to end this." Ben nodded, setting down his coffee and crossing the room to her. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, his eyes meeting hers. "We're almost there, Rachel. After today, Harper's going to be behind bars, and those kids will never have to worry about her again." Rachel exhaled, leaning into his touch. "I just want this to be over. I want to know that they're safe, that no one can take them away." "We'll make sure of it," Ben promised, his voice firm. "Once we get Harper, we'll fight for those kids. They're not going anywhere." Rachel nodded, her heart clinging to the hope that they were finally nearing the end of this nightmare. But even as she tried to hold on to Ben's words, a flicker of doubt crept in. Miss Harper had been manipulating the system for years. What if she had one last trick up her sleeve? By the time Ben and Dave arrived at the orphanage later that day, the sky had darkened again, thick clouds gathering on the horizon like an ominous warning. The police convoy pulled up outside the old, crumbling building, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the front lawn. The air was thick with tension, every officer bracing for what they might find inside. Ben's heart raced as he stepped out of the car, his eyes locked on the orphanage's front door. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the culmination of everything he and Dave had uncovered over the past few days. It all came down to this. Dave joined him, his face grim but resolute. "You ready for this?" Ben nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Let's do it." The team moved quickly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the building. Ben's pulse quickened, his senses on high alert as he led the way up the front steps. He raised his hand, signaling for the officers to take their positions, and then knocked on the door. For a moment there was nothing, just the hollow sound of the knock echoing through the quiet house. Then slowly, the door creaked open, and Miss Harper appeared, her thin, angular frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. "Officer Williams," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ben didn't waste any time. He held up the warrant, his eyes hard as he stared her down. "We have a warrant to search the premises." Miss Harper's expression didn't falter, but Ben saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew. She knew this was the end. "I see," she said smoothly, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "Well then, I suppose you'd better come in." She stepped aside, and Ben and Dave entered, the team of officers following close behind. The house was just as Ben remembered it. Dark, cold, and filled with the musty scent of neglect. But now, knowing what was hidden behind its walls, the place felt even more sinister. "We're going to need access to all your records," Dave said, his voice firm as he addressed Harper. Miss Harper smiled thinly. "Of course. I'll retrieve them for you." Ben's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust her, not for a second. "We'll come with you." Harper hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then she nodded, her smile never wavering. "As you wish." As Miss Harper led them to her office, Ben's pulse raced. He knew that somewhere within these walls were the answers they'd been searching for, the proof of Harper's trafficking ring, the missing children, and the dark web of lies she had spun over the years. But the question was, how far would Harper go to protect herself? The office was just as cramped and cluttered as it had been during Ben's last visit. Miss Harper moved behind the desk, her hands moving deftly over the stack of papers as she pulled out several files. "These are the adoption records," she said, her voice smooth but hollow. "As you can see, everything is in order." Ben stepped forward, his eyes scanning the documents. But as he flipped through the pages, his gut told him something wasn't right. The records were too perfect, too clean. There were gaps, discrepancies, names that didn't match the previous reports. "Where are the files on the children who disappeared?" Ben asked. His voice was hard. Harper's smile faltered. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Officer Williams. All of our children have been placed with loving families." Ben's patience snapped. He slammed the folder shut, his eyes burning with fury. "Enough with the lies, Harper. We know what you've been doing. The missing children, the illegal adoptions. It all ends here." Miss Harper's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can stop this? You think you can save those children? They were never yours to save." Ben's blood boiled, but before he could respond, Dave stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We'll see what the evidence says, Harper. But for now, you're coming with us." Miss Harper's face twisted with rage, but she didn't resist as the officers moved to handcuff her. Ben's heart pounded as he watched her, knowing that the fight was far from over. But for now, they had her. They had proof. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. Back at the station, as the rain began to fall again, Ben sat at his desk, sifting through the mountain of evidence they had recovered from the orphanage. The files, the financial records, the testimonies from families like the Kellers were all there, a web of deceit and corruption that Miss Harper had carefully constructed over the years. It was overwhelming, but it was enough. Dave walked into the room, a satisfied look on his face. "She's in custody. We've got enough to charge her." Ben nodded, relief flooding through him. It was over. They had done it. But even as the weight of the victory settled in, he couldn't help but think of Tyler, Ethan, and Emma, the children who had suffered at Harper's hands and the ones who hadn't made it out. "We did good, Ben," Dave said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You did good." Ben leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body. "It's not over yet. We still have to make sure those kids stay safe." Dave clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll make sure of it." Ben nodded, though the weight of the task ahead still hung over him. But for the first time, in a long time, he felt like they were finally moving forward. When Ben returned home that evening, the house was filled with the soft sounds of children playing. Rachel was in the living room, sitting on the floor with Ethan and Emma as they rolled around on a colorful playmat. Tyler was nearby, stacking blocks into a precarious tower, his face more relaxed than it had been in days. Rachel looked up as Ben entered, her eyes filled with relief. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "It's over. Harper's in custody. She won't be hurting anyone else." Rachel exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxed as the tension drained from her body. "Thank God." Ben crossed the room, kneeling beside her as he reached out to gently brush his fingers over Ethan's soft hair. "We did it, Rachel. They're safe." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I was so scared, Ben. I didn't know if we'd make it." Ben wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they held each other in the quiet of the living room. The nightmare was over. They faced the darkness and came out the other side. Tyler, who had been watching them quietly, finally spoke, his voice small but steady. Are we staying here? With you and Rachel?" Ben looked at Rachel, his heart full as he met her gaze. They both knew the answer, but they wanted Tyler to hear it, to feel the security of their decision. "You're staying with us," Ben said, his voice firm but filled with warmth. "This is your home now, all of you." Tyler's eyes widened, his lips parting in disbelief. "Really?" Rachel smiled through her tears, nodding as she pulled Tyler into a hug. "Really? You're part of our family now." Tyler's face lit up with a smile, a real smile, the first one Ben had seen since the day he found him on that rainy street. And in that moment, Ben knew they had finally found their way through the storm. The weeks that followed were a blur of court hearings, paperwork, and legal proceedings, but through it all, Ben and Rachel stood firm. They fought for custody of Tyler, Ethan, and Emma, and after months of uncertainty, they were finally granted legal guardianship of the children. The day the judge signed the papers, officially declaring Tyler, Ethan, and Emma part of their family, felt like the culmination of everything they had been fighting for. It wasn't just a victory over Miss Harper. It was the beginning of something new, something beautiful. On the day of the adoption hearing, Ben and Rachel sat in the courthouse, surrounded by friends and family who had come to support them. Tyler sat between them, holding Rachel's hand tightly as the judge read the final ruling. "With this decision," the judge said, his voice warm and kind, I declare Tyler, Ethan, and Emma to be legally adopted by Benjamin and Rachel Williams. I wish you all the best in this new chapter of your lives." Tears filled Rachel's eyes as she pulled Tyler into a tight hug, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had become her son. Ben felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at the twins, their tiny hands clutching his as they sat in his lap. They had done it. They were a family. Back at home, the house was filled with laughter and joy as friends and family gathered to celebrate. Tyler, Ethan, and Emma played in the backyard, their laughter ringing out through the warm afternoon air, while Ben and Rachel stood on the porch, watching them with full hearts. Rachel leaned her head against Ben's shoulder, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "We made it." Ben smiled, wrapping an arm around her as they watched their children play. "Yeah, we did." The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt and fear. But they had made it through the worst of it. They had found their way back to each other, and they had built something stronger than the pain that had once threatened to tear them apart. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the yard, Ben felt a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't the family he had imagined all those years ago, but it was perfect in its own way. And as he watched his children play, surrounded by love and laughter, he knew that they had finally found the home they had been searching for. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Ben and Rachel watched their children play, filled with a sense of peace and gratitude. Their journey had been long and difficult, but in the end, they had found what they were searching for, a family and a future full of hope. Rachel smiled up at Ben, and as they stood there side by side, she whispered, "We've come so far." Ben nodded, his heart full, "And we'll go even further." The soft sounds of laughter from Tyler, Ethan, and Emma filled the air, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. This was their new life, one filled with love, resilience, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Dear friends, thank you so much for following us on this emotional journey. We hope this story touched your heart just as much as it did ours. If you enjoyed this tale of hope, family, and resilience, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can stay connected for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. Make sure to leave a comment below and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more inspiring and captivating stories, check out the playlist that's just popped up on your screen. Until next time, stay safe, keep dreaming, and remember, sometimes the greatest families are the ones we build along the way.